Infasira tells us that in 1485, some workmen digging on the Appian Way came across an old Roman sarcophagus inscribed with the name Julia, daughter of Claudius. On opening the coffer, they found within its marble womb the body of a beautiful girl of about 15 years of age, preserved by the embalmer's skill from corruption and the decay of time. Her eyes were half open, her hair rippled round her in crisp curling gold, and from her lips and cheek the bloom of maidenhood had not yet departed. Borne back to the capital, she became at once the center of a new cult, and from all parts of the city crowded pilgrims to worship at the wonderful shrine, till the Pope, fearing lest those who had found the secret of beauty in a pagan tomb might forget what secrets Judea's rough and rock-hewn sepulchre contained, had the body conveyed away by night, and in secret buried. Legend though it may be, yet the story is none the less valuable as showing us the attitude of the Renaissance towards the antique world. Archaeology to them was not a mere science for the antiquarian. It was a means by which they could touch the dry dust of antiquity into the very breath and beauty of life, and fill with the new wine of romanticism forms that else had been old and outworn. From the pulpit of Nicola Pisano down to Mantegne's Triumph of Caesar, and the Service Cellini designed for King Francis, the influence of this spirit can be traced. Nor was it confined merely to the immobile arts, the arts of arrested movement, but its influence was to be seen also in the great Greco-Roman masques, which were the constant amusement of the gay courts of the time, and in the public pomps and processions with which the citizens of big commercial towns were wont to greet the princes that chanced to visit them. Pageants, by the way, which were considered so important that large prints were made of them and published, a fact which is a proof of the general interest at the time in matters of such kind. And this use of archaeology in shows, so far from being a bit of priggish pedantry, is in every way legitimate and beautiful. For the stage is not merely the meeting place of all the arts, but is also the return of art to life. Sometimes in an archaeological novel, the use of strange and obsolete terms seems to hide the reality beneath the learning, and I dare say that many of the readers of Notre Dame de Paris have been much puzzled over the meaning of such expressions as le casaque à mahuitre, le vougier, le gallimard taché d'encre, le craquenier, and the like. But with the stage how different it is. The ancient world wakes from its sleep, and history moves as a pageant before our eyes, without obliging us to have recourse to a dictionary or an encyclopedia for the perfection of our enjoyment. Indeed, there is not the slightest necessity that the public should know the authorities for the mounting of any piece. From such materials, for instance, as the disc of Theodosius, materials with which the majority of people are probably not very familiar, Mr. E. W. Godwin, one of the most artistic spirits of this century in England, created the marvelous loveliness of the first act of Claudian, and showed us the life of Byzantium in the 4th century, not by a dreary lecture and a set of grimy casts, not by a novel which requires a glossary to explain it, but by the visible presentation before us of all the glory of that great town. And while the costumes were true to the smallest points of color and design, yet the details were not assigned that abnormal importance which they must necessarily be given in a piecemeal lecture, but were subordinated to the rules of lofty composition and the unity of artistic effect. Mr. Simons, speaking of that great picture of Mantegne's, now in Hampton Court, says that the artist has converted an antiquarian motive into a theme for melodies of line. The same could have been said with equal justice of Mr. Godwin's scene. Only the foolish called it pedantry, only those who would neither look nor listen spoke of the passion of the play being killed by its paint. It was in reality a scene not merely perfect in its picturesqueness, but absolutely dramatic also, getting rid of any necessity for tedious descriptions, and showing us, by the color and character of Claudian's dress, and the dress of his attendants, the whole nature and life of the man, from what school of philosophy he affected, down to what horses he backed on the turf. And indeed, archaeology is only really delightful when transfused into some form of art. I have no desire to underrate the services of laborious scholars, But I feel that the use Keats made of Lempriere's dictionary is of far more value to us than Professor Max Muller's treatment of the same mythology as a disease of language. Better Endymion than any theory, however sound, or, as in the present instance, unsound, of an epidemic among adjectives. And who does not feel that the chief glory of Piranesi's book on vases is that it gave Keats the suggestion for his ode on a Grecian urn? Art, and art only, can make archaeology beautiful, and the theatric art can use it most directly and most vividly, for it can combine in one exquisite presentation the illusion of actual life with the wonder of the unreal world. But the 16th century, 1500s, was not merely the age of Vitruvius. It was the age of Vesilio also. Every nation seemed suddenly to have become interested in the dress of its neighbors. Europe began to investigate its own clothes, and the amount of books published on national costumes is quite extraordinary. At the beginning of the century, the Nuremberg Chronicle, with its 2,000 illustrations, reached its 5th edition, and before the century was over, 17 editions were published of Munster's Cosmography. Besides these 2 books, there were also the works of Michael Collins, of Hans Weigel, of Amann, and of Vesilio himself, all of them well illustrated, some of the drawings in Vesilio being probably from the hand of Titian. Nor was it merely from books and treatises that they acquired their knowledge. The development of the habit of foreign travel, the increased commercial intercourse between countries, and the frequency of diplomatic missions gave every nation many opportunities of studying the various forms of contemporary dress. After the departure from England, for instance, of the ambassadors from the Tsar, the Sultan, and the Prince of Morocco, Henry VIII and his friends gave several masques in the strange attire of their visitors. Later on, London saw, perhaps too often, the sober splendor of the Spanish court, and to Elizabeth came envoys from all lands, whose dress, Shakespeare tells us, had an important influence on English costume. And the interest was not confined merely to classical dress, or the dress of foreign nations. There was also a good deal of research, amongst theatrical people especially, into the ancient costume of England itself, and when Shakespeare, in the prologue to one of his plays, expresses his regret at being unable to produce helmets of the period, he is speaking as an Elizabethan manager, and not merely as an Elizabethan poet. At Cambridge, for instance, during his day, a play of Richard III was performed, in which the actors were attired in real dresses of the time, procured from the great collection of historical costume in the Tower, which was always open to the inspection of managers, and sometimes placed at their disposal. And I cannot help thinking that this performance must have been far more artistic as regards costume than Garrick's mounting of Shakespeare's own play on the subject, in which he himself appeared in a nondescript fancy dress, and everybody else in the costume of the time of George III, Richmond especially being much admired in the uniform of a young guardsman. For what is the use to the stage of that archaeology which has so strangely terrified the critics, but that it, and it alone, can give us the architecture and apparel suitable to the time in which the action of the play passes? It enables us to see a Greek dressed like a Greek, and an Italian like an Italian, to enjoy the arcades of Venice and the balconies of Verona, and, if the play deals with any of the great eras in our country's history, to contemplate the age in its proper attire, and the king in his habit as he lived. And I wonder, by the way, what Lord Lytton would have said some time ago, at the Princess's Theatre, had the curtain risen on his father's Brutus reclining in a Queen Anne chair, attired in a flowing wig and a flowered dressing gown, a costume which in the last century was considered peculiarly appropriate to an antique Roman. For in those halcyon days of the drama, no archaeology troubled the stage or distressed the critics, and our inartistic grandfather sat peaceably in a stifling atmosphere of anachronisms, and beheld with the calm complacency of the age of prose an Ishimo in powder and patches, a Lear in lace ruffles, and a Lady Macbeth in a large crinoline. I can understand archaeology being attacked on the ground of its excessive realism, but to attack it as pedantic seems to be very much beside the mark. However, to attack it for any reason is foolish. One might just as well speak disrespectfully of the equator. For archaeology, being a science, is neither good nor bad, but a fact simply. Its value depends entirely on how it is used, and only an artist can use it. We look to the archaeologist for the materials, to the artist for the method. In designing the scenery and costumes for any of Shakespeare's plays, the first thing the artist has to settle is the best date for the drama. This should be determined by the general spirit of the play, more than by any actual historical references which may occur in it. Most Hamlets I have seen were placed far too early. Hamlet is essentially a scholar of the revival of learning, and if the allusion to the recent invasion of England by the Danes puts it back to the 9th century, 800s, the use of foils brings it down much later. Once, however, that the date has been fixed, then the archaeologist is to supply us with the facts which the artist is to convert into effects. It has been said that the anachronisms in the plays themselves show us that Shakespeare was indifferent to historical accuracy, and a great deal of capital has been made out of Hector's indiscreet quotation from Aristotle. Upon the other hand, the anachronisms are really few in number and not very important, and had Shakespeare's attention been drawn to them by a brother artist, he would probably have corrected them. For, though they can hardly be called blemishes, they are certainly not the great beauties of his work, or at least, if they are, their anachronistic charm cannot be emphasized unless the play is accurately mounted according to its proper date. In looking at Shakespeare's plays as a whole, however, what is really remarkable is their extraordinary fidelity as regards his personages and his plots. Many of his dramatis personae are people who had actually existed, and some of them might have been seen in real life by a portion of his audience. Indeed, the most violent attack that was made on Shakespeare in his time was for his supposed caricature of Lord Cobham. As for his plots, Shakespeare constantly draws them either from authentic history, or from the old ballads and traditions which served as history to the Elizabethan public, and which even now no scientific historian would dismiss as absolutely untrue. And not merely did he select fact instead of fancy as the basis of much of his imaginative work, but he always gives to each play the general character, the social atmosphere, in a word, of the age in question. Stupidity he recognizes as being one of the permanent characteristics of all European civilizations, so he sees no difference between a London mob of his own day and a Roman mob of pagan days, between a silly watchman in Messina and a silly justice of the peace in Windsor. But when he deals with higher characters, with those exceptions of each age which are so fine that they become its types, he gives them absolutely the stamp and seal of their time. Virgilia is one of those Roman wives on whose tomb was written Domi mensit, lanum ficit, as surely as Juliet is the romantic girl of the Renaissance. He is even true to the characteristics of race. Hamlet has all the imagination and irresolution of the northern nations, and the Princess Catherine is as entirely French as the heroine of De Vaucannes. Harry V is a pure Englishman, and Othello a true Moor. Again, when Shakespeare treats of the history of England from the 14th, 1300s, to the 16th, 1500s centuries, it is wonderful how careful he is to have his facts perfectly right. Indeed, he follows Holinshed with curious fidelity. The incessant wars between France and England are described with extraordinary accuracy, down to the names of the besieged towns, the ports of landing and embarkation, the sites and dates of the battles, the titles of the commanders on each side, and the lists of the killed and wounded. And as regards the civil wars of the Roses, we have many elaborate genealogies of the 7 sons of Edward III. The claims of the rival houses of York and Lancaster to the throne are discussed at length, and if the English aristocracy will not read Shakespeare as a poet, they should certainly read him as a sort of early peerage. There is hardly a single title in the upper house, with the exception of course of the uninteresting titles assumed by the new lords, which does not appear in Shakespeare, along with many details of family history, creditable and discreditable. Indeed, if it be really necessary that the school board children should know all about the Wars of the Roses, they could learn their lessons just as well out of Shakespeare as out of shilling primers, and learn them, I need not say, far more pleasurably. Even in Shakespeare's own day, this use of his plays was recognized. The historical plays teach history to those who cannot read it in the chronicles, says Haywood in a tract about the stage, and yet I am sure that 16th century, 1500s, chroniclers were much more delightful reading than 19th century primers are. Of course, the aesthetic value of Shakespeare's plays does not, in the slightest degree, depend on their facts, but on their truth, and truth is independent of facts always, inventing or selecting them at pleasure. But still, Shakespeare's use of facts is a most interesting part of his method of work, and shows us his attitude towards the stage, and his relations to the great art of illusion. Indeed, he would have been very much surprised at anyone classing his plays with fairy tales, as Lord Lytton does, for one of his aims was to create for England a national historical drama, which should deal with incidents with which the public was well acquainted, and with heroes that lived in the memory of a people. Patriotism, I need hardly say, is not a necessary quality of art, but it means, for the artist, the substitution of a universal for an individual feeling, and for the public, the presentation of a work of art in a most attractive and popular form. It is worth noticing that Shakespeare's first and last successes were both historical plays. It may be asked, what has this to do with Shakespeare's attitude towards costume? I answer that a dramatist who laid such stress on historical accuracy of fact would have welcomed historical accuracy of costume as a most important adjunct to his illusionist method, and I have no hesitation in saying that he did so. The reference to helmets of the period in the prologue to Henry V may be considered fanciful, though Shakespeare must have often seen the very casque that did affright the heir of Agincourt, where it still hangs in the dusky gloom of Westminster Abbey, along with the saddle of that imp of fame, and the dinted shield with its torn blue velvet lining and its tarnished lilies of gold. But the use of military tabards in Henry VI is a bit of pure archaeology, as they were not worn in the 16th century, 1500s, and the king's own tabard, I may mention, was still suspended over his tomb in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, in Shakespeare's day. For up to the time of the unfortunate triumph of the Philistines in 1645, the chapels and cathedrals of England were the great national museums of archaeology, and in them was kept the armor and attire of the heroes of English history. A good deal was of course preserved in the Tower, and even in Elizabeth's day, tourists were brought there to see such curious relics of the past as Charles Brandon's huge lance, which is still, I believe, the admiration of our country visitors. But the cathedrals and churches were, as a rule, selected as the most suitable shrines for the reception of the historic antiquities. Canterbury can still show us the helm of the Black Prince, Westminster the robes of our kings, and in Old St. Paul's, the very banner that had waved on Bosworth Field was hung up by Richmond himself. In fact, everywhere that Shakespeare turned in London, he saw the apparel and appurtenances of past ages, and it is impossible to doubt that he made use of his opportunities. The employment of lance and shield, for instance, in actual warfare, which is so frequent in his plays, is drawn from archaeology, and not from the military accoutrements of his day. And his general use of armor in battle was not a characteristic of his age, a time where it was rapidly disappearing before firearms. Again, the crest on Warwick's helmet, of which such a point is made in Henry VI, is absolutely correct in a 15th century play, 1400s play, when crests were generally worn, but would not have been so in a play of Shakespeare's own time, when feathers and plumes had taken their place, a fashion which, as he tells us in Henry VIII, was borrowed from France. From the historical plays, then, we may be sure that archaeology was employed, and as for the others, I feel certain that it was the case also. The appearance of Jupiter on his eagle, thunderbolt in hand, of Juno with his peacocks, and of Iris with her many-colored bow, the Amazon mask and the mask of the five worthies, may all be regarded as archaeological, and the vision which Posthumus sees in prison of Caecilius Leonatus, an old man attired like a warrior, leading an ancient matron, is clearly so. Of the Athenian dress by which Lysander is distinguished from Oberon, I have already spoken, but one of the most marked instances is in the case of the dress of Coriolanus, for which Shakespeare goes directly to Plutarch. That historian, in his Life of the Great Roman, tells us of the oak wreath with which Caius Marcius was crowned, and of the curious kind of dress in which, according to ancient fashion, he had to canvass his electors, and on both of these points he enters into long disquisitions, investigating the origin and meaning of the old customs. Shakespeare, in the spirit of the true artist, accepts the facts of the antiquarian and converts them into dramatic and picturesque effects. Indeed, the gown of humility, the wolvish gown, as Shakespeare calls it, is the central note of the play. There are other cases I might quote, but this one is quite sufficient for my purpose, and it is evident from it at any rate that, in mounting a play in the accurate costume of the time, according to the best authorities, we are carrying out Shakespeare's own wishes and method.